Welcome to Clinical Trialblazers, a podcast by Parexel Biotech, where we dive deep into the journeys of the industry leaders who are shaping clinical research and biotech innovation. I am your host, Alberto Grignolo. My guest today, Joe von Rickenbach, has spent decades shaping the landscape of clinical research and pharmaceutical development. He has left an indelible mark on how new medicines are discovered, developed, and brought to patients worldwide. In 1982, Joe co-founded Parexel, a global clinical research organization, or CRO. That's right, today's episode hits close to home. In leading Parexel for over 3 decades, Joe championed the early globalization and digitization of clinical trials and drove the data-driven modernization of trial execution. His strategic vision transformed a startup of 2 into a global enterprise, fundamentally reshaping the industry. Since stepping away from his executive role at Parexel in 2018, Joe has remained deeply engaged in the industry as an investor, strategic advisor, and thought leader, among other endeavors. He currently serves as a board director of Javara and other companies, where he continues to drive innovation in clinical research. This episode hits close to home for me personally as well. I should mention that Joe hired me in 1992, and I worked at Parexel continuously until my retirement in late 2023. So I had many opportunities to watch Joe lead and to learn from him. He taught me everything I know, but not everything he knows. I look forward to learning more from him today. Joe, welcome to Clinical Trialblazers.
Thank you, Alberto. Terrific introduction. Really appreciate it.
What was the initial idea that drove you to start Parexel as a company of 2? I'll tell the audience that at the time, you were a young man of 28 years of age, an immigrant from Switzerland, a Harvard MBA graduate, and you partnered with a seasoned 55-year-old co-founder, Dr. Ann Saig. So, why Parexel?
So I think it was, if you want, an entrepreneurial drive that had, kind of ignited this idea. And we didn't really start as a CRO. We actually started as a regulatory consulting company. This opportunity arose, and I partnered with Ann Saig at that time. And that's what got us going.
And what did each of you bring to the table as you were beginning this new organization of 2?
So we were actually a very good team because, first of all, we were very compatible personally. But she was an amazing technical, scientific, and regulatory expert, and but didn't really care about the business side at all. And so, my job basically was the client relations and all the other back office activities that a new business has to face and overcome, and Ann was essentially the operations side and did that amazingly well. We never really got into each other's hair, if you want. We were just a really good team.
So the name Parexel, did you come up with this name? Where does it come from? What's the origin?
It actually is a derivation of Paracelsus. Paracelsus was a Swiss alchemist who lived during the Renaissance time, and he was a pioneer in medical thinking, basically throwing out the old ideas of Galen, that diseases were influenced by fire and earth and stars, and he believed that agents, even if we can't see them, at the time were the causes of disease. And he actually ran probably the first kind of primitive clinical trial. But I also felt that Paracelsus was not exactly a modern name, and so I kind of changed it a little bit and made it more palatable for the times.
So Parexel, as you mentioned, did not start as a CRO. It started as a regulatory consulting firm. Do I get that right?
Correct. Yeah, you're correct.
So how did it become a CRO and running clinical trials?
Our client base were mainly medium-sized and small companies abroad, meaning companies in Germany, in Switzerland, in Italy, in France, and in Japan. Those were basically our original markets. And we had a pretty good client base, and one pattern that started to emerge was that almost all these companies desired to ultimately register their products in the US and eventually market their products in the US. And almost invariably, they needed a clinical trial or several. And we made those recommendations, and they said, this is great, but how can we run these clinical trials? And it turns out there was no option, and they asked us, is there a way to do this? And it turned out there wasn't. And so I conferred with Anne, that maybe we should consider doing this. The origin of the clinical trials idea came from that.
I see. In fact, I remember around 1986, I was working for a small Italian company based in Washington, D.C., and you visited me. I did not know you at the time. You came to see me.
Correct.
And you were
Yes.
trying to sell me clinical trial services. And as I remember it, I said, thanks, but no thanks. We're running our own. And I sent you away. And 6 years later, you hired me anyway. So thank you for not holding a grudge.
Well, it's all about building and maintaining relationships. It's a small community.
That's right. So let's stay with clinical trials. How would you say the clinical trial landscape has evolved since you established Parexel in 1982, and where do you think it's headed now?
Well, I think there is no comparison. One reason why it was nearly impossible to run a commercial clinical trial for a medium-sized European company in the US was because almost all clinical research, commercial clinical research, was done by big pharma companies. All the processes, the know-how was inside these companies. And so, of course, indirectly, this forced almost any foreign company to license their product to a US company, and vice versa. I mean, this was not just in the US the case, it was the case around the world. There is, of course, the order of magnitude of activity is much higher. There are literally now thousands, tens of thousands of clinical trials that are conducted every year, which at that time was not the case.
So where are clinical trials headed now, in your opinion?
One of the absolutely amazing changes that has occurred over the ages was the digitization and the use of technology. And I think the combination of that and the onset also of AI is going to enable a level of transparency and execution that we would have never even dreamed of 25 years ago. I believe the efficiencies of the execution of the trial are improving. So there are several new technologies that are literally, as we speak, being deployed that are AI enabled, for instance, in data management. Also, there is a lot of innovation in patient recruitment, enrollment, and retention in clinical trials, which has been a perennial problem and actually the least innovated and changed over the decades.
Yeah, the landscape is changing as we speak, clearly. Joe, it's worth saying outright, you are among the very few who helped birth the modern clinical research organization industry, CROs. This required entrepreneurial spirit, which you did mention, and a substantial dose of vision, courage, resilience, and probably other character qualities. So I want to ask you, where did that spirit, that entrepreneurial spirit, come from? Was it family? Was it culture, ambition, adversity, something else?
Hard to say. I think it's partly just personality. I grew up in a very kind of traditional family in a fairly conservative environment in Switzerland, and entrepreneurship was not exactly, encouraged. And I certainly didn't have any role models there. One of the things that revealed itself coming to the US was exactly that. I was completely mesmerized by that. The fact that one has this, freedom and opportunity, and I loved it, to be honest. I took to it almost from day one.
Switching gears a little bit, can you give me an example of a time that your work had a particularly significant impact on drug development, on clinical trials, and ultimately on patients? A moment when you felt especially proud of what you were contributing to the industry and to patients?
Yeah, I mean, look, Parexel has an amazing history with that in mind. We were very early involved in biotech. So, for instance, we ran one of the earliest programs for EPO, for J&J. But where Parexel was really shining was in the AIDS crisis, which eventually led to a sole partnership with ICAD, the Intercompany Consortium for AIDS Drug Development. Remember, those were cocktails often that companies needed to develop to help patients. And so they needed essentially a neutral ground. And so it was a natural outsourcing opportunity from our point of view. ICAD was a consortium of pharmaceutical companies, included about, I'd like to say, maybe 15, 18 of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. And we essentially ran all these trials. I can really say to this day, there is no other organization that ran more clinical trials, had more experience in clinical research as far as AIDS goes than Parexel.
Well, thank you for sharing that. How would you describe your leadership style and how has it evolved over time?
Parexel went through many phases during my tenure. We went from basically a startup in a basement to a large company. When I left, we had 20,000 employees in 52 countries in 84 locations. If I kind of look back, there were what I would call strategic increments in the evolution of a company. Startup is one of those increments. Early growth is one of those increments. Scaling is one of those increments. And the leadership, meaning the top leadership required for each of those phases, is totally different. And I literally stood in front of the mirror and asked myself, first of all, do I want to be this leader? And secondly, what is required of this person to be really effective? And hopefully the best person that the company can field. And you had to then, make those changes. And it required significant changes in style, in leadership style, in decision-making, in delegation, et cetera, all aspects of management and leadership.
I want to ask you more specifically, for example, were you ever a micromanager that needed to be in the weeds, particularly in the early stages of the company? And then eventually, how did it feel to steer a vastly larger global organization where micromanaging probably was impossible? And how did that shift force you to change your style?
So I was totally a micromanager. Of course I was that. We had very scarce capital in the beginning. I signed off on literally every expense. In fact, I went through every line item of expense to make sure, that financially we were sound and that we didn't overextend ourselves. But as I said, this eventually had to change. And a big part of leadership is to hire, really competent people, including leaders. And so once we had a CFO who I really trusted, I had no problem delegating that, knowing and trusting that basically my own approach would be either duplicated or even improved, and that was the case. And on the operational and technical side, I think one of the key success factors for Parexel, in fact, was that I was not a scientist or a medic. because I never competed with these people. So we were able to attract really great talent.
Was it very difficult to let go? Again, you admitted to being a micromanager, and I would presume that someone like that would have a very difficult time letting go.
You have to be a micromanager when you start a company as a leader of a startup. But as I said before, you have to eventually stand in front of a mirror, and you're in a different phase now. And the question is, can you make those changes?
Sure. Over the years, you have made tens of thousands of decisions. I'm curious about the one or two most difficult business decisions you ever had to make, and how did you arrive at making those decisions?
One of the things that I found now, especially in hindsight and with my involvement with many entrepreneurs, is loyalty is a very big deal in a startup environment. And as a result, for me, the most difficult decisions always were people decisions, especially recognizing when somebody petered out, when do you make that change? And especially and specifically also if you have and when you have to make a layoff. I still remember when we had our first layoff, it was probably, it's in 94, by the way. And
yep.
It was by far the most difficult decision I made until that point for me. And to this day, I remember, the people walking out there in the parking lot, with their boxes. And, it was just devastating for me. Up until that point, we were growing, and it was all about growth and adding. And we just didn't really we were not confronted with that. And I have to say, on balance also, if you had to sort of typecast the personality, I'm basically a growth person. I love growth to this day of all kinds. By the way, under my leadership, Parexel grew every year. 2 years, not much, but still we grew. And, so when you get to a situation where that's challenged and you have to kind of go sideways or even down, it was really tough for me.
I'd like to ask you about how you make decisions. I have known you to be exceptionally logical, rational, business-minded, no-nonsense, pragmatic. So how have you balanced over the years rational logic versus emotion, gut feeling, when you were growing the business, navigating thousands of opportunities and challenges, decisions over more than 3 decades? Being a very rational person, do you ever let emotion and gut feeling contribute to your decision-making?
I almost never have a meeting without first looking at the facts and the numbers. If somebody shows up without numbers, I send them back, and I want those numbers. But of course, you get to a point where analysis stops. You have to do all the analysis. You have to know all the facts. And especially in this age, in this time, there is so much you can determine analytically. I mean, it's, an order of magnitude more and better than what we used to have, just because of AI and, all the tools that are available today. And the transparency that is available today. The final few percentages ultimately are gut, no doubt. You can only bring that into play once all the analysis that can be done actually has been done.
I know you focus on numbers. I know it very well. In fact, I remember particularly painful episodes for me when I presented my quarterly results to you in the executive committee, and I had missed my numbers 2 quarters in a row. And you said to me in front of everybody, if you were a company, I would not invest in it. So that got my attention, and I believe my numbers improved after that. Thank you for motivating me.
Yeah, that would be an example. Yes.
Joe, you founded and led Parexel for 35 years. Now, most CEOs and founders don't last 35 years at the same organization, except maybe Warren Buffett and a few others. How do you explain your long shelf life?
First of all, it's always performance. Remember, we talked about the difficult transition from owning the company to having to losing control and having the venture capitalists involved. That was really the most difficult transition for me. But once you are primarily a leader, a corporate executive versus primarily an owner, the processes which I described to you before were basically critical. What I would call strategic increment required, the leadership, the vision, and ultimately the execution to succeed. And I was, if that had not happened, I would have been absolutely removed, much earlier. And by the way, and I sometimes joke, but only it's a half a joke, and that is, there has not been a quarter in Parexel's history since 1986 where somebody did not want to remove me. That was always on the table. Okay, so there was by no means, a given.
Since stepping away from your executive role in 2018, you've remained active as an investor and advisor through roles like board directors in several organizations. How has your perspective on the industry evolved in this time since leaving Parexel? What are you most focused on now? What opportunities do you see in clinical research and biopharma?
When you were in the company that long and as focused and dedicated as I was, it's very difficult to get an overall perspective. Everything comes through the filter of that position, meaning all the information you get and all your points of views ultimately are influenced by, your position. And everybody who talks to you with that in mind. And so in my new incarnation, I'm basically independent, if you want. And I have much more access to, and I think in a much more objective way, in terms of what's happening, what companies are thinking, what the investors are thinking. And so I have to say I enjoyed this period. This has also been really rewarding. So I would say the focus has gone from basically being an active executive and leader to basically an advisor. By the way, interestingly, in my personal life, I have moved to be a grandfather also. And in fact, in some ways, it's really similar. You really, as a board member and as an advisor, you sort of have ownership for a day or a week, but then you hand it back over to the management. And they have to basically, run and deliver on whatever goals and objectives are set. And so it was a very natural transition. What helped in my transition was the fact that I started another company. I was a co-founder of Heliovision, which is an ophthalmic biopharma company, basically. And I forgot how intense a startup was, because a lot of time had passed, and so this was a very intense experience, highly absorbing for a couple of years, right following the transition from Parexel. And so I didn't really have any time. I literally ended Parexel on Friday and started at Heliovision on Monday, and I never had time to kind of be too reflective. I had to really, get immersed in the challenges of that business.
But speaking of startups, and finally, Joe, my final question, what advice do you give to entrepreneurs and aspiring leaders in today's environment? For example, if you had to build an organization from scratch today, first of all, would you do it? And secondly, what would you do differently and what would you do the same?
Yeah, so as I said before, I'm very involved with many companies. I started to keep a list of all the people who I think I'm a mentor to. And it's a fairly extensive list. And many of them are in various stages of startup and growth, but also some are mature companies or maturing companies. So first of all, I'd say, in my opinion, the opportunity has never been bigger. I mentor several companies that are AI startups, and the speed and agility and the execution possibility is so amazing that it's just inspiring. They go through this journey that used to take years, 5 to 10 years, in 2-3 years at a much lower cost point. And also through the technology enablement, you are able to attract much better teams much faster because people don't have to physically relocate. Several of these startups basically are virtual companies that have people all over the world, or certainly all over the United States, almost from day one. Also, capital is abundantly available. Remember, I said Parexel was the first CRO that got funded. In '86, we were one of 3 healthcare services companies that got institutional venture capital. It was incredibly difficult to get funded. And today, basically, if you have a decent idea and you have a decent team, you get funded, you get a shot. So it's, in my opinion, a great environment.
Thank you. Sadly, we need to come to a close, Joe. Fascinating conversation. This wraps up this episode of Clinical Trialblazers. A big thank you to you, Joe, co-founder of Parexel, industry leader, for joining us today and sharing your wonderful perspectives on so many topics relevant to the industry and to aspiring leaders. Be sure to join us for upcoming episodes of Clinical Trialblazers, where we dive into the people and stories driving innovation across biopharma and biotech. If you enjoyed today's conversation, don't forget to rate and review the podcast on your favorite platform. It really helps others discover the show. Clinical Trialblazers is created by Parexel Biotech and hosted by me, Alberto Grignolo, with production support from Acast Creative Studios. Thank you for listening. Until next time, stay curious and continue advancing the future of clinical research.